I'm Keith Becker from DD's Rentals, and we're talking about the costs of property management. Now, we've talked about the actual management commission itself and tenant placement services, which are the two primary issues that most owners anticipate as far as what property management costs. And in a different conversation, we talked about some of the ancillary circumstances associated with possible sale transactions and vendor relationships and administration fees and so forth. I'd like to talk about the relationship and the obligations of tenants, applicants, and tenants. And this is, to some measure, one of the more cautious, if you will, types of circumstances, because property management is very much a customer service business. And while in some instances it's possible to generate substantial source of revenue from tenants, at the same time, you do not want to develop an adversarial relationship with those tenants, because you do best when you have happy, stable, long-term tenants who are taking care of the property. So it is something to be aware of, and while none of this is unethical, you want to know how the property management firm relates with tenants from a financial standpoint. Bear in mind, the first thing, each and every potential tenant is going to pay an application fee. And application fees are anticipated and expected to be for services rendered. It is the cost associated of receiving, qualifying, evaluating potential applicants to determine whether they are indeed appropriate for residence at your individual property. So they are a cost incurred by the property management firm. The application fees are typically, under almost all circumstances, kept by the management firm to offset the expenses that they've incurred. Late fees is the primary cost that tenants sometimes find themselves paying. In a perfect world, I prefer that every single tenant pay their rent on time. I really don't want late fees, but it is also something where if the rent is received late, it is indeed typically written into the tenant's rental contract that there's an X% late fee. How is that late fee accounted for? Does the property management firm keep that late fee in its entirety? Do they give it to you in its entirety? Or is it something in between? You get half, they get half. Furthermore, if a tenant pays late and they haven't paid all of the obligations, the rent plus the late fee, how will your property manager account for that? Will they pay the rent first, and if there is anything left over, apply it to the ancillary costs? Or are they going to pay these ancillary costs first and then apply the remainder to the rent? Because if they do it in that way, it's entirely possible that the property management firm has, accepted, received, and generated the late fee, but the rent is not paid in full. You want to know how that is, you genuinely want to know how that is structured. There are incidental costs that a tenant might very well find themselves responsible for. Incidental costs would be, for example, if a tenant decides that they want to make a change to the contract. They have one tenant moving out, another tenant moving in, or some combination thereof, and the contract has to be rewritten in order to account for this transition. The property management firm could arguably and justifiably charge a document preparation fee. If you have a tenant who hasn't paid the rent on time, and a 3-day notice, for example, needs to be served to the tenant for non-payment of rent, is there a process service fee? It's not unfair, it's not unjustified, but the question is, what are these ancillary charges that might be charged to a tenant? What happens, for example, if the tenant has set an appointment with a vendor shows up, tenant's not home, or tenant doesn't allow them access? Will the property management firm charge them a missed service call? What about lost keys? Or what about when they don't return everything when they move out? Are there incidentals that the property management firm might charge? There are the more creative things, actually, and I've heard of companies where, for example, they've instituted sort of a pet approval process. Now, the pet approval process is for your advantage, but at the same time, it's also a source of income to the property management firm, where there's a very complex structure. The tenant pays for it, and the property manager inspects the property on a periodic basis, even as many as 3 times a year, to make sure that the tenant is taking care of the property, make sure that the pet isn't doing any damage. There are some creative ways that property managing firms interrelate with tenants. You want to know how those work, and you want to know what the impact on tenants in terms of finances could conceivably be. Not necessarily because it's coming out of your pocket per se, but ultimately it does become part of the profitability of your property in terms of ensuring that you've got a tenant who has a good and productive relationship with a professional property management firm. Property management can be a very complicated business. We're here to help you simplify it. Please feel free to call me if I can be of help in any way. My name is Keith Becker, and I'm from DD's Rentals.